I'm sharing my time with Deputy Brown, and I wish to move the Sinn Fein amendment to this motion. And at the outset, I want to disassociate myself. Yeah.
It's already been, but you can speak to it.
One
amendment has already been moved.
I want to disassociate myself from those people who have attacked the fact that this debate is even being discussed. No organisation, no sector, no body can receive tens of millions of euro in public money without expecting public debate in terms of the expenditure of that money. And having said that, we know that the greyhound sector plays an important social and economic role in many communities across the country. It is made up of many good people who care for their dogs and who contribute positively to our society. But there are real and very genuine concerns that are shared by many Irish people regarding animal welfare in the sector, and also regarding accountability and transparency of state funding to the sector. We in Sinn Féin support exchequer funding for sectors that bring a benefit to rural economies and communities, including the horse and the greyhound sectors. We also believe that with exchequer funding comes responsibility. When public monies are invested, there must be public accountability. Greyhound funding in 2020 amounted to €17 million. That, by any standards, is a substantial level of funding. And we know that a 2017 assessment suggested that greyhound racing delivers an economic benefit of about €302 million, primarily in rural communities. And that means jobs, investment and resources in areas that are often devoid of opportunities for development. The sector is facing the same pressures as others as a result of COVID-19, and that's a reality that too can't be ignored. So a number of questions have arisen as a result of this debate with regard to funding of the sector. The first is the principle as to whether any funding at all should go to the greyhound sector. The Social Democrats' motion calls for the phasing out of all funding by 2025. Sinn Féin do not support this position. As I've said, this would have a detrimental economic impact on many rural communities that have already been left behind, but the move would also be detrimental to the stated objective of this motion. Should all state funding to the industry be removed, it would result in the sector operating purely on a for-profit basis. And most people, I think, will starkly see what this would mean for animal welfare. The motion also relies heavily upon analysis that the sector would not be financially viable independent of exchequer funding. I think that fails to acknowledge that almost all social, sporting and cultural pursuits would face the exact same challenges were all exchequer funding withdrawn. So, accepting the premise that funding can be warranted, the second question is to what conditions come with the funding. I mentioned the very real and valid concerns regarding animal welfare. All funding must be contingent on the highest standards of animal welfare and care. And it's not just good enough to say that the standards are high. There must be robust monitoring and enforcement of those standards, and that monitoring and enforcement must be carried out independently. And aside from welfare, there is a requirement to ensure that there is full accountability and transparency in terms of how all monies are spent. An organisation that receives millions in public funding should present all of their accounts for scrutiny. And there must be an assessment as to how the monies are distributed. The greatest concern and complaint I have with regard to greyhound funding comes from within that sector itself. Many breeders and smaller operators tell me that they don't get a fair slice of the cake, despite doing everything correctly from their point of view. So there's no point in lauding the economic benefits of these funds if we don't make sure that they actually go to where they will have the greatest benefit. And I, for one, am sceptical that the diversion of huge portions of the funding to prize money actually results in the trickle-down redistribution that is often suggested. The third question, then, is whether the government's proposal to increase the funding to the greyhound sector by €2.4 million in 2021 is warranted. And from Sinn Féin's perspective, we can't support that proposal. First of all, the government have failed to offer and outline the rationale for this particular increase. Why was €2.4 million necessary? Why was €1.4 million not sufficient? Why was €3.4 million not required? The truth is that it's an arbitrary figure, arbitrarily linked to the Horse Racing Fund, which has been divided on an 80% 20% basis for several years. And when I asked the Minister in committee yesterday for the rationale for this particular breakdown, he essentially responded was because it was always done this way. This House has not been provided with a business case, with an economic assessment or any independent analysis that this funding is particularly required for this sector next year. And given the many competing and urgent demands on public services such as our health services at this time, Sinn Féin don't believe it's prudent to increase funding to the greyhound industry this year in the absence of such analysis. Even within the Department of Agriculture, there are several sectors that require additional funding. Our suckler farmers are under immense pressures. Our sheep farmers are struggling to make ends meet. Many family farms have been hit by COVID-19 through a variety of ways, including through the loss of second incomes and other pressures. They too would benefit from additional funding, and the case has not been sufficiently made that the greyhound sector deserves it more than any other. So Sinn Féin's amendment recognises that funding is required to the sector, but calls for an increase of €2.4 million to be waived. It calls for funding to be contingent on the highest animal welfare standards being in place and adequately monitored and enforced, and it also calls for full accountability and transparency to be in place. And further, it calls for a long-term strategy for the sector to be developed. This strategy is pivotal. If there is to be a future for the greyhound sector in Ireland, and it's our wish that there will be, then there must be a plan. It cannot be business as usual. It cannot be a case that governments come to this House year after year proposing increases in funding without adequately outlining how this money will be invested. In 2014, the greyhound sector received an annual payment of €11 million. It has risen every year since, bar one. The government now proposes that next year it will be increased to €19.2 million. Quite frankly, the sector should be thriving with such support. Those who are at the heart of it, the local breeders, the trainers, those ancillary workers, tell me that it's not. The obvious deficiencies need to be addressed before any more blank cheques are signed. And while recognising that the industry has made some improvements in terms of animal welfare, it would be absolutely foolhardy to suggest that all is fixed. It's not. Most people in the sector will acknowledge that. So if this issue and the issue of animal welfare isn't given the urgent consideration that it necessitates, then public opinion will quickly move to a point whereby no government will be in a position to allocate these type of resources. I thank Deputy Cairns for bringing this issue to debate in this House. It's one of those issues where both the original motion and the government amendment warrant consideration and make valid positions. But for the reasons I have outlined, I believe that the Sinn Féin amendment is the most appropriate course of advancement on this issue.